Why would a mother lovingly swaddle her newborn, kiss its tiny forehead, and then bury it alive? That's not the start of a horror movie. It's something that happened in the prehistoric world, an unthinkable choice made by desperate families, in a time so harsh that survival itself felt like a cruel game show with no prizes and no host. Hi there. Welcome to tonight's history story for sleep, where we'll gently wander through the strange, the tragic, and the occasionally absurd corners of human prehistory. Yes, we're diving into a dark subject, but don't worry, this is a bedtime story. My job is to make it soothing, atmospheric, and maybe a little funny, because if you're going to dream about ancient people, they might as well be entertaining. So why on earth did ancient mothers sometimes bury their babies alive? The answer lies in the desperate mathematics of survival. Food was scarce, winters were brutal, and predators lurked everywhere. For families scraping by, another hungry mouth could tip the balance from survival to starvation. But this story isn't just about tragedy. It's about resilience, creativity, and the strange, sometimes darkly comedic ways humans have managed to muddle through the millennia. And by the end of this journey, you'll know not only why those mothers made such choices, but also what that says about the roots of our humanity today. So, tuck yourself in, grab a blanket, and maybe whisper a quiet thanks that you were born in an age of central heating, pizza delivery, and grocery stores, with 17 brands of hummus. Let's drift back, way back to a world where survival meant hard choices, and bedtime meant hoping a saber-toothed cat wasn't using your cave as an Airbnb. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a world before streetlights, before Wi-Fi, before snack drawers with chocolate bars waiting for you. Imagine instead a sky so black it feels endless, dotted with stars brighter than any city could ever allow you to see. Beneath that sky lies a world both familiar and alien, a world where the ground crunches with frost in the mornings, where shadows move in the tree line, and where every single sound at night could mean either dinner or danger. This is the prehistoric world. And if you were alive then, the first thing you would notice is how small you are compared to everything else. You're not the apex predator. Not yet. You're not the one people write textbooks about. You're just another struggling animal trying to make it through another cold night. Wolves hunt in packs. Lions roam the plains. Saber-toothed cats crouch silently in the tall grass. And even the birds, yes, birds eye you suspiciously, as though they know you might trip and fall and make a decent snack. Humans weren't kings of the world. We were the weird naked apes who somehow kept showing up everywhere, stubborn as weeds, armed with little more than rocks, sticks, and the occasional sharp idea. Food was not just scarce, it was a daily obsession. Forget scrolling Instagram or checking the fridge 5 times, hoping something new appears. In the prehistoric world, if you didn't secure food by nightfall, you didn't eat. Hunting was risky and exhausting, and gathering plants was like playing Russian roulette with your stomach. One root might keep you alive for another day. Another, which looks exactly the same, might send you into convulsions. And yet, against all odds, humans somehow made it through, which is either a testament to our ingenuity or proof that luck loves a messy underdog story. Now imagine raising a child in this world. You're already struggling to keep yourself alive, keeping the fire from going out, keeping your hut or your cave warm enough that your toes don't freeze off. And now you've got this tiny creature who screams at random intervals, an excellent way to advertise to every predator within a mile that, hey, dinner is ready, come, and get it. Babies don't understand stealth. They don't care about survival tactics. They care about milk and warmth, and they let the whole valley know about it. The cost of raising children back then wasn't just emotional, it was existential. A single wailing infant could give away your hiding place, and suddenly your entire band of 30 people is running from something with claws bigger than your arms. Let's not forget the elements. Winters weren't cozy postcard winters with snowflakes and hot cocoa. They were brutal, endless, bone-crackingly cold. A fire could mean the difference between life and frostbitten death, and sometimes, even fire wasn't enough. Storms would rage for days, rivers would freeze solid, and if you were unlucky enough to be born during one of those winters, well, let's just say your odds weren't great. Parents had to decide whether they could even afford the energy to keep a baby warm all night. Blankets weren't soft cotton throws from Target, they were animal hides, stiff and scratchy, and often still smelled faintly of their former owners. Then there's the question of predators. You'd think the biggest problem would be saber-toothed cats or cave bears, but honestly, some of the scariest predators were the little things. Parasites, bacteria, invisible killers that no one could see but everyone felt. A simple infection could kill faster than a lion. A bad cut could turn into a death sentence. Babies, with their fragile immune systems, didn't stand a chance half the time. And parents knew this. Every new baby was born under the looming shadow of, will they survive a month, a season, a year? But here's the thing about humans. Even in this grim, dangerous world, people still loved, they still laughed, they still tried to make each other smile. Imagine sitting around the fire at night. The kids are playing with sticks, the adults are chewing on whatever scraps they managed to roast. And someone cracks a joke about how Og the hunter tripped over his own spear earlier and almost impaled himself. Laughter breaks through the cold, the fear, the hunger. For a brief moment, you're reminded that you're not just an animal. You're part of something bigger, something that, against all odds, believes tomorrow might be better. It's in this setting that children were both treasures and burdens. A child meant the continuation of the group, the hope of future hunters, gatherers, storytellers. But a child also meant risk, extra mouths to feed, sleepless nights when silence was survival. Parents didn't have the luxury of abstract philosophy. They lived in a world where every decision was made under the hard, unblinking gaze of scarcity. And when scarcity ruled, sacrifices were sometimes made. So, the stage is set. The prehistoric world was not kind, and it certainly wasn't gentle. It was a place where every breath was earned, where every step was taken carefully, where survival came at an enormous cost. Raising children wasn't a cute milestone with photo albums and baby showers, it was a gamble played with stacked odds. And often, it was a gamble that parents simply couldn't afford to play. Now let's do the math. Don't worry, I'll keep it soothing. No calculators needed, no pop quizzes at the end. But imagine you're part of a small group of maybe 30 people. That's it. 30 souls clinging together in a harsh, indifferent landscape. You live together, eat together, sleep huddled close for warmth. You rely on each other for everything. Food, protection, companionship. And in this world, every extra mouth changes the equation. Food is measured not in calories, but in sheer survival value. A rabbit might feed one hungry adult for a night. A deer could keep the group going for a few days. But babies? Babies don't contribute to the hunt, don't help with gathering, don't even pull their weight in keeping predators away. They take and take and take. Milk from their mothers, warmth from the fire, energy from the group. And the return on investment? Years away, if they even make it that far. In a world where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, that kind of long-term investment was sometimes more risk than reward. It's a harsh truth, but one extra baby could tip the balance from survival to disaster. Imagine winter supplies carefully rationed, each person receiving just enough to survive. Then suddenly, another infant is born. That means the mother needs more food to produce milk. The baby needs warmth and constant care, and the group as a whole has to carry extra weight on journeys. Every additional ounce of responsibility strained the fragile balance, holding the tribe together. And if the group failed, if the food ran out because resources had to stretch too thin, it wasn't just the baby who died. It could be everyone. This was the cruel arithmetic of survival. Sometimes, saving the many meant sacrificing the one, or the very smallest ones. Now, before you start thinking prehistoric people were cold and heartless, remember this: they weren't. They loved their children. They mourned their dead. But they lived under pressures we can barely imagine. It wasn't about love. It was about math written in blood and bone. If the group perished, so did every child. Hard choices weren't heartless, they were desperate acts of preservation. Imagine the conversations, though they weren't in words like ours. A mother, exhausted, trying to soothe her baby's cries. The group glancing nervously into the night, where predators prowled, drawn closer by the sound. Someone whispers, or grunts, or gestures, that this noise could doom them all. It's not malice, it's fear. Not cruelty, but calculation. In some cases, tribes might try to hide the cries, to muffle them with furs, to soothe the child with what little food they had. But sometimes, it wasn't enough. And that's where the arithmetic came in. One baby might cost the lives of 30 people. One decision could mean the survival of the tribe. And that's the logic, as horrifying as it sounds, behind why some ancient mothers buried their infants alive. The arithmetic didn't stop with food and predators. Carrying capacity mattered too. Imagine trekking across a frozen plain, your group hauling everything they own on their backs. Tools, hides, weapons, the fire they carefully carried in smoldering embers. Now, imagine adding a crying, fragile, helpless infant to that load. An infant that can't walk, can't be put down for long, can't survive without constant attention. Every mile becomes harder, every hour becomes riskier. And if one person stumbles, it could cascade into disaster for the group. And yet, here we are, proof that many of those babies did survive. Enough parents made the impossible choice to keep their children alive, to gamble against the arithmetic, to believe that tomorrow might offer just enough food, just enough safety, just enough mercy. Those parents defied the math, and because of that, we exist. But countless others couldn't. They did the only thing they thought would save the tribe. And so the arithmetic, cold and merciless as it was, played out in whispered decisions beneath prehistoric skies. When we think about burial, we usually imagine something ceremonial, maybe solemn faces around a polished casket, a priest muttering something you can't quite hear, and someone dropping a handful of dirt as a final goodbye. But the prehistoric world did not come with velvet curtains, flower wreaths, or even the luxury of consistent goodbyes. Burial, back then, was many things at once. It was ritual, yes, but also practicality. It was a survival strategy, as much as it was an emotional act. Because in a world where resources were few, predators were plenty, and space was contested, what you did with a body mattered as much as what you did with the living. Imagine this: a group huddled in a cave, smoke curling up from a fire, the flames just strong enough to keep away the chill. In the corner lies a small figure, silent, unmoving, no longer part of the group's rhythm. There are no undertakers, no graveyards, with headstones lined in neat rows. There is only a decision to make. What happens next? With this little body, leave it in the open, and scavengers will come. Hyenas, wolves, even big cats will smell it from miles away. That means danger, not just for the dead, but for everyone still alive. So, the group digs. With stone tools, with sticks, sometimes with bare hands, scraping into cold soil or shifting rocks aside. They carve out a space to place the body, then cover it carefully. Some of the earliest burials we've uncovered, from places like Kafzeh Cave in Israel or Shanidar Cave in Iraq, show that even tens of thousands of years ago, people weren't just tossing their dead aside. They were arranging them, sometimes curling bodies in fetal positions, sometimes including tools, flowers, or offerings. It was as if the living were saying, "This person mattered, they are gone, but they are still part of us." For infants, the situation carried an added layer of complexity. A baby's death wasn't uncommon, it was, sadly, expected. But how you treated the body carried meaning for both the spirit world and the living. In some cases, archaeologists have found tiny skeletons buried under the floors of dwellings. Imagine that. A baby laid to rest, not in some far-off cemetery, but literally under the family's home. It sounds chilling to us, but to them, it might have felt like keeping the child close, ensuring their presence lingered, protecting the group from the dangers of restless spirits. Or, more practically, it might have been about not wasting the energy to trek across frozen plains for a burial spot when you could simply dig into the soft earth beneath your feet. Burial wasn't always about reverence. Sometimes, it was about sanitation. Bodies, decay, and decay attracts danger. The smell of decomposition is basically an advertisement to every scavenger in the area. Free food. By burying the dead quickly, prehistoric people reduced those risks. You can picture a clan murmuring whatever counted as words for them, patting down the soil over a tiny grave, and then hurrying back to the fire because they knew predators were never far away. But rituals developed alongside survival instincts. Even in harsh conditions, humans couldn't resist adding meaning to the act of burial. Sometimes ochre-red mineral pigment was sprinkled over bodies, staining bones with symbolic color. Sometimes objects were left: a stone blade, a necklace of shells, or in one case, the wing bones of birds. These weren't just leftovers. They were signs of thought, of an emotional dimension, of trying to connect death with something more than tragedy. Even in grief, people found time for beauty. Now, when it came to burying infants alive, the line between ritual and survival blurred even more. Was it simply survival calculus, one less mouth to feed, one less cry to give away the group's location? Or was it also couched in a belief system that made the act bearable? Perhaps mothers told themselves the child's spirit was going to join ancestors, or that burying the baby was releasing it back to the earth from which all life came. Survival wrapped itself in spirituality like a blanket, softening the edges of unbearable choices. Humor creeps in here, too, in the absurdity of human nature. Imagine the storytelling around the fire. Someone saying, "Well, at least the ancestors won't be lonely tonight," and others chuckling, not because it was funny, but because laughter makes tragedy survivable. Dark humor, after all, is as old as death itself. It was a release valve, letting grief leak out slowly, rather than crush people entirely. So, burial was never just about the dead. It was about protecting the living, reassuring the grieving, keeping predators at bay, and giving meaning to choices that otherwise would have been unbearable. Whether it was a respected elder or a fragile infant, every burial carried layers of ritual and strategy. And in those small acts of digging, covering, painting bones with ochre, or slipping a trinket into a shallow grave, we see not only survival instincts, but also the first flickers of culture. The need to tell stories, to hold on to memory, to say that even in a brutal world, life and death had meaning. It's not easy to drift to sleep thinking about the mortality rates of ancient babies, but perhaps that's part of the strange comfort of history, because the story of humanity is not one of constant triumph. It's a story of surviving despite staggering loss, of love pressed against overwhelming odds. And nowhere is that clearer than in the statistics of infant mortality in prehistory. Let's start with the blunt truth. Most babies did not survive. Some estimates suggest that in prehistoric hunter-gatherer groups, nearly half of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Imagine that. Flip a coin at birth, and heads meant you might live long enough to walk, talk, and learn how to throw a rock at a squirrel. Tails meant you wouldn't see your next season. It's grim, but it was normal. Parents didn't just know this, they expected it. Hope and grief were companions at every birth. Consider what it meant for mothers. Carrying a child to term was itself dangerous. Without modern medicine, childbirth often ended in tragedy, either for the baby, the mother, or both. Even if birth went smoothly, the next hurdle was feeding. If the mother was malnourished, her milk supply might not sustain the child. And finding supplemental food? That was even trickier. No formula aisle at the local store. No emergency stash of powdered milk. It was breast milk or nothing. And nothing happened far too often. Then came disease. Without antibiotics, even minor infections could turn deadly. A fever, a cough, or diarrhea, all things we brush off today, could wipe out an infant in hours. Add parasites, contaminated water, and exposure to harsh weather, and you can see why so many little lives ended before they had a chance to begin. And yet, in the midst of all this, families still celebrated new births. Imagine the joy in a small band when a baby survived, its first month, its first year. Each milestone was an event, a moment of relief and gratitude. If a child reached the age of 5, the odds of survival jumped dramatically. That's when parents could breathe a little easier. Not completely, after all. Saber-toothed cats and rival clans were still around, but easier. The psychological toll must have been enormous. Modern parents lose sleep if their baby catches a cold. Prehistoric parents went to bed every night, knowing tomorrow their child might not wake. That's not to say they didn't bond. Quite the opposite. They loved fiercely, knowing each day was borrowed time. You can almost picture a mother rocking her baby by the fire, whispering lullabies not just for comfort, but as a way to savor the fleeting sweetness of that fragile life. Humor, again, might have been a strange balm. People joked about survival because the alternative was despair. Perhaps they teased each other about who had the stubborn babies, who cried loudest but somehow kept hanging on. Maybe they laughed when toddlers ate dirt, half relieved that at least it wasn't poisonous. In those chuckles we hear echoes of modern parents who sigh when their kid eats crayons, same exasperation, just with higher stakes. Statistics alone can sound cold, but behind them lies a remarkable resilience. Imagine a band of 30 people, losing child after child, and yet still choosing to try again, still risking love, still bringing new life into a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. That's human hope distilled to its purest form. And here's something oddly soothing. Despite all those losses, enough children survived. Enough stubborn, lucky, well-fed, well-protected little humans grew up, learned to throw spears, gathered berries, told stories, and passed on their genes. Enough made it through the bottleneck of mortality that today, we're here. You, me, billions of us. Every one of us is proof that at least one of our ancestors' children beat those impossible odds. So, while prehistoric infant mortality was heartbreakingly high, it was also the backdrop for one of humanity's most incredible achievements: survival. Parents buried countless tiny bodies. Yes, but they also celebrated countless tiny victories. They found ways to laugh, to grieve, to try again. And in that rhythm of loss and resilience, humanity endured. It's easy, thousands of years later, to reduce prehistory to statistics and cold facts. Half the babies died, mothers buried children under the floor, fathers sharpened tools and carried on. But if you strip away the raw numbers and archaeological jargon, what you're left with is something deeply human: heartbreak. And not the romantic heartbreak of pop songs, not the kind where you binge ice cream and complain about text messages left unread, but heartbreak so fundamental, it shaped who we are as a species. Imagine a mother cradling her newborn in a world where tomorrow is never guaranteed. She knows, deep down, that the odds are against her child. She's seen it before. She's seen tiny bodies wrapped in hides, lowered into shallow graves, covered with ochre and tears. And still, she hopes. Hope was the great act of rebellion in prehistory. Every smile coaxed from a baby's lips, every gurgling sound near the fire, was a defiance of the statistics. Parents laughed, cooed, and kissed their babies, because to love them was the only way to endure the constant possibility of loss. And the losses were constant. One child dies, and the grief spreads through the group like smoke from the fire. They weep quietly, they carry the little body outside, they bury it, and then they come back inside to eat, because the living still need food. Survival doesn't wait for grief to finish. Grief and survival lived side by side, two stubborn roommates in the human psyche. One says, sit and weep. The other says, get up and hunt. Somehow, people did both. But humor, strange, dark humor was part of the medicine. People in dire times have always found ways to joke, because laughter is the only thing strong enough to sit across from despair and say, not tonight. Maybe someone, trying to comfort a grieving mother, muttered that the ancestors just wanted more company, and another chimed in that hopefully the ancestors at least knew how to babysit. These were not jokes to make people laugh until they cried. They were jokes to make crying people laugh, however briefly. And that little moment of humor might have been the only thread strong enough to pull someone back toward life. Heartbreak in prehistory wasn't silent, either. Archaeological evidence suggests people expressed their grief physically and audibly. Some bodies were found carefully buried with beads, or covered in red ochre, as though painted for a journey. Others show signs of ritual gestures, like hands placed over the chest or curled into fetal positions, as if returning to the womb of the earth. These details suggest mourning was not hidden. It was visible, tangible, and it mattered. It mattered because grief, as heavy as it was, had to be carried together. And think of the weight of that grief, stretched across generations. It wasn't just one mother burying one child. It was countless mothers, countless fathers, countless siblings. It was the rhythm of life: birth, hope, fear, death, grief, repeat. And still, humanity didn't stop. If anything, the heartbreak seemed to sharpen love. Prehistoric parents didn't withhold affection to protect themselves from loss. Quite the opposite. They poured love in, knowing it might be brief, knowing that those few days, weeks, or years might be all they got. And maybe that's why our species became so emotionally complex. We had to evolve hearts big enough to love even when loss was the likeliest outcome. The heartbreak shaped culture, too. Storytelling around the fire wasn't just entertainment, it was a balm. Stories about ancestors, about spirits, about children who had gone on to another world, all of these helped people carry grief. Even the way groups treated burial sites showed that memory mattered. They weren't erasing children. They were finding ways to hold on to them, to place them in the story of the tribe. The heartbreak of prehistory feels remote, yet strangely familiar. Parents then feared losing children the way parents now fear it. They clung to laughter, ritual, and storytelling for comfort, just as we do. And while they didn't have grief counselors or sympathy cards, they had each other, huddled in the flickering light of fire, leaning on community, whispering hope into the cold night. So yes, the emotional weight of loss in prehistory was crushing, but it didn't crush humanity. It tempered us, the way fire tempers metal. It made us creatures of resilience, capable of joy even when joy seemed impossible. And maybe that's why, even in the darkest chapters of our history, we always find ways to sing, to laugh, to hold each other close, and to keep going. When you strip away the romantic images of hunters striding across icy plains with spears in hand, the real heroes of prehistory come into sharper focus. The mothers. They weren't just nurturing figures cooing over babies. They were strategists, resource managers, healers, negotiators, and, when it came down to it, the final arbiters of life and death. Think about it. A mother's body was the starting point for survival. She carried the child, often undernourished, often in brutal conditions, with no doctors, no midwives with sterile gloves, just other women who'd been through it themselves, armed with experience and hope. When labor came, she had to endure pain and risk we can barely comprehend. And then, if she survived, she immediately faced another monumental task: feeding. Milk was the only food an infant could digest, and milk came from her body. If she didn't eat enough, if she fell ill, if the group was short on food, the child starved. That meant mothers were constantly calculating how much food to take, what to save, what to share, always measuring their child's survival against the needs of the group. And when food ran out, mothers were the ones who faced the cruelest decisions. Do you keep feeding the weakest child, knowing that your own body is failing? Do you pour scarce calories into a baby who might not survive the winter? Or do you save yourself to feed the children who already have a chance? These are decisions that would rip modern parents apart. Yet prehistoric mothers had no choice but to face them with clear, if aching, eyes. Archaeological evidence hints at the importance of women in these choices. In many burial sites, infants are found tucked beside women, suggesting mothers were responsible for tending to them even in death. In some cases, children were buried within the home, the mother's domain, under the hearth or near sleeping areas. It's a haunting image. Mothers literally carrying their children into the earth, making the final call not only on how life was given, but how death was managed. And yet, it wasn't all sorrow. Mothers also became the keepers of knowledge. They knew which plants could soothe a fever, which roots were safe to eat, which streams still had clean water. They passed down songs, stories, and survival tricks. While men may have been out hunting, women ensured the group didn't starve on days when the hunt failed. And when the group faced impossible scarcity, it was often women who rationed, who decided who got a little more and who got a little less. These decisions were not abstract. They were life and death, and they shaped the destiny of the entire tribe. It's no wonder that in so many later cultures, women were linked to both life and death, fertility and burial, creation and destruction. That symbolism wasn't invented out of thin air. It came from millennia of mothers making those choices in real time, under impossible pressure. And yes, humor lived here, too. Imagine a circle of women around the fire, swapping complaints about babies who wouldn't sleep, or joking that if Og didn't come back with a mammoth tomorrow, they'd all be eating bark stew again. These small flashes of wit were survival in their own right. A mother might laugh about the absurdity of chasing toddlers away from dangerous fires, or scolding a child for eating beetles, even while knowing beetles might end up as dinner anyway. Humor lightened the weight, even when the weight never left. So mothers weren't just caregivers. They were leaders in disguise. They managed the invisible economy of calories, warmth, and risk. They were the ones who made the unbearable decisions, sometimes burying a child alive, because keeping it might doom the entire family. They carried grief, but they also carried memory, ensuring that knowledge, rituals, and stories didn't vanish when the fire went out. When we talk about survival in prehistory, we often highlight the hunters, the tools, the migrations. But behind every spear point and every cave painting was a mother who had made a choice, sometimes a dozen choices in a single day, that kept her family, and by extension, the species, alive. When we think about prehistoric survival, it's tempting to imagine rugged individuals, heroic hunters with spears slung over their shoulders, lone mothers shielding children from saber-toothed cats, one family against the odds. It makes for a nice movie poster. But in reality, survival wasn't a solo adventure. It was math. And not the fun kind, where you figure out how much pizza everyone gets. It was cold, unforgiving arithmetic, where the numbers had to add up, or everyone paid the price. A prehistoric tribe was small. Picture 30, maybe 40 people at most. That's smaller than a modern classroom. And yet within that group was an entire world. You had hunters, gatherers, elders, children, maybe a shaman or two who pretended to have special insight into the weather by squinting at clouds and saying, "Yes, rain soon." Everyone's role mattered because the margin for error was razor thin. Lose too many hunters to injury, and the group went hungry. Lose too many children, and there was no future. Lose too many elders, and you lost the wisdom of where to find water in a drought, or which plants were safe, when every berry looked suspiciously poisonous. Now imagine the arrival of a newborn. To modern eyes, that's cause for celebration. Balloons, awkward relatives, casseroles. But to the tribe, a baby was also an equation. One more mouth meant dividing food more thinly. One more cry meant predators might find you. One more fragile body meant more chances for disease to sweep through everyone. The tribe couldn't afford to think only in terms of individual love. It had to think in terms of collective survival. Would the baby strengthen the group in the long run, or weaken it in the short term? And sometimes, tragically, the math didn't work out in the baby's favor. This communal perspective wasn't cruel. It was logical, born from necessity. Think of the group like a fragile raft in a stormy sea. Each person was a plank. If too many planks were weak or broken, the raft sank, and everyone drowned. So the tribe protected the raft, even if it meant tossing over some cargo. That cargo, heartbreakingly, could sometimes be the tiniest members. But the tribe also carried burdens together. A mother wasn't alone in her grief. Her sorrow was shared, absorbed into the group's collective memory. Others stepped in to comfort, to help with surviving children, to whisper stories around the fire that reminded everyone why they were fighting so hard to stay alive. This shared grief became shared resilience. Even decisions that feel brutally personal, like whether to keep or abandon an infant, were rarely made alone. Elders, other women, sometimes even hunters weighed in. Can we manage another life right now? Do we have enough food stored? Will this child live through the winter? It wasn't about one mother's cold calculation. It was about the tribe measuring the fragile balance between survival and collapse. And while it sounds harsh, there's a strange tenderness in it too. The tribe wanted to survive as a whole. Sacrifices were made so the community could endure. Of course, this communal math led to friction. Imagine trying to decide whether to keep feeding a sickly child when resources were dwindling. One group member might argue for mercy, another for practicality. Voices rose, emotions cracked, and someone probably muttered, "Well, if you're so sure we'll make it, why don't you hunt that mammoth yourself?" The prehistoric version of family arguments wasn't about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. It was about who lived and who didn't. No pressure. But even within those debates, there was structure. Tribes valued cooperation over everything else. Cooperation was their secret weapon. Lions had teeth, bears had claws, humans had group projects. And for once in history, group projects actually worked. People pooled their skills, their food, their care. They shared burdens, both physical and emotional. And while this sometimes meant carrying grief together, it also meant celebrating survival together. When a child did survive, the whole tribe rejoiced, because every victory was communal, just as every loss was communal. So survival wasn't about rugged individuals. It was about a group holding itself together through storms, hunger, and predators. The tribe was the safety net, the calculator, the raft. And if the math was cruel, it was only because cruelty was sometimes the only path to continued existence. We complain today about rent, about tiny apartments, where your neighbor's blender sounds like it's in your own kitchen. But the prehistoric housing crisis made even the worst studio apartment seem like a palace. Space was not only about comfort, it was about survival. And it wasn't just physical space, but emotional and social space, too. Let's start with caves. Caves were the penthouses of prehistory: stone walls, ready-made shelter, natural insulation, and prime real estate that never needed a mortgage. But here's the catch. Everyone wanted them. Caves weren't just popular with humans. Bears loved them. Lions loved them. Hyenas adored them. Moving into a cave was basically squatting in someone else's home, and that someone else usually had sharper teeth than you. Archaeologists have found evidence of cave systems where humans and predators alternated occupancy, like an awkward Airbnb, where the listing didn't mention the landlord was a cave bear. For those who couldn't secure a cave, huts were the fallback. These weren't Pinterest-ready cottages with cozy decor. They were skeletal frameworks of wood, covered with hides or grass, maybe reinforced with bones. Sometimes they leaned against cliffs or nestled in shallow pits to reduce exposure. A good hut could keep wind and snow at bay, but it wasn't exactly spacious. Imagine cramming 30 people into a space smaller than your living room. Privacy was non-existent. If someone snored, everyone knew. If someone passed gas, everyone knew, and probably complained loudly in whatever words or grunts they had available. Space was also metaphorical. With everyone jammed together, tensions brewed. One person hoarded food, another complained about firewood. Someone else accidentally sat on the only decent fur blanket. Humans, even then, needed a balance between closeness and breathing room. Too much closeness led to fights. Too much distance led to vulnerability. The tribe had to negotiate this invisible housing crisis every day. And then there were babies. Babies didn't understand space. They took up room, made noise, demanded warmth, and added pressure to already crammed conditions. Imagine a hut in midwinter, 30 bodies huddled close, smoke from the fire choking the air, hides dripping condensation, and in the middle of it all, a baby wailing at full volume. The sound bounced off walls, filled every ear, and reminded everyone that privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Sometimes, the lack of space had practical consequences. A sick child in a small hut meant everyone got sick. One coughing, feverish infant could take down half the group in days. Families probably tried to separate the sick when they could, maybe shifting them closer to the hut's entrance, or wrapping them in hides further from the fire. But, in a space that small, contagion spread faster than rumors. And yet, these tight quarters also built intimacy. When you live shoulder to shoulder, you learn to read each other's moods. You know who is grieving, who is hopeful, who is quietly planning tomorrow's hunt. That closeness meant empathy grew. Survival was tied not only to shelter, but to connection, to living as one organism instead of 30 individuals. It's easy to laugh at the idea of a prehistoric housing crisis, but it was real. Caves were crowded or contested, huts were flimsy, and space, both physical and emotional, was scarce. And yet, humans endured. They adapted, shifted, compromised. They learned how to live with each other in cramped spaces, how to share grief and joy in equal measure. They survived the cold, the predators, the lack of privacy, and even the baby who wailed all night. And in that survival, they laid the foundation for the communities, the villages, the cities that would follow. So when you stretch out tonight in your bed, even if you feel cramped, remember, your prehistoric ancestors would have thought you lived in a palace. No bears trying to reclaim their cave, no hut collapsing in a snowstorm, no 30 relatives breathing down your neck while you sleep. You have space, you have warmth, you have survived the housing crisis. If you've ever opened your refrigerator, stared at the half-empty shelves, and sighed dramatically, you've experienced about 1/1000th of the anxiety that defined prehistoric life. We call it being hungry. They called it being alive. The fridge of prehistory wasn't a glowing box humming in the corner of your kitchen. It was the entire landscape, and most of the time it was empty. Food scarcity wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was the constant drumbeat underneath daily life. Every morning began with the same question: what can we eat today? Sometimes the answer was exciting. Maybe the hunters returned, dragging a deer, or the gatherers stumbled on a patch of berries not already stripped by birds. Other days, the answer was more like, I guess we'll gnaw on these roots and hope they don't make us vomit. Every bite mattered. The human body, delicate yet demanding, doesn't let you go long without food. Babies cried because they were hungry. Adults grew weak and clumsy, which made hunting even harder. And the elderly? They often went without, letting the young eat first, because if the group didn't keep its strongest alive, no one survived. Survival wasn't just about who could fight off predators. It was about who had enough calories left to swing a spear or carry firewood. Now, imagine bringing a baby into this mix. A baby that consumes milk endlessly. Milk that requires the mother to eat more than usual. When food is already scarce, that extra demand can push the math into dangerous territory. 1 less rabbit caught, 1 less patch of nuts gathered, and suddenly the group is starving. So choices had to be made. Not because parents didn't love their children, but because love doesn't magically produce venison. If only it did. Humanity would have invented pizza 800,000 years ago. Scarcity also shaped rituals. Some tribes developed taboos about eating certain foods, not because they were picky eaters, but because they were saving resources. Leave the seeds so plants will grow again. Don't kill the last pregnant animal in a herd. These weren't just rules. They were survival strategies, disguised as moral codes. And yet, even with caution, the food ran out often enough to make hunger a constant guest at the fire. It's worth noting that scarcity wasn't evenly distributed. Some areas were more fertile, some seasons kinder, some groups luckier, but luck was fickle. A bad storm, a migrating herd, an early frost, and abundance could turn into famine overnight. Scarcity was a lurking shadow, always waiting to pounce, always reminding families that survival was conditional. This is why infanticide existed, not because people were cruel, but because the cruelest thing of all was starvation. Imagine watching 30 people weaken and collapse because you insisted on keeping one extra child alive when food simply wasn't there. The math was brutal, but the logic was unyielding. Scarcity forced impossible choices, and those choices became part of the rhythm of survival. Humor might seem out of place here, but even in scarcity, humans laughed. Picture the group gathered around a fire, sharing the smallest scraps, and someone cracks a joke about eating their shoe. Someone else says it might taste better than the last root they dug up. The laughter doesn't fill bellies, but it fills spirits, and sometimes that's the only thing that gets you through another night of emptiness. Scarcity wasn't just about food, though it was about control. It reminded everyone that no matter how clever humans became, the earth still held the upper hand. And in that imbalance, survival depended on cooperation, compromise, and sometimes sacrifice. Scarcity forced people to make decisions that echo through history, decisions that remind us survival wasn't about thriving but about enduring. If scarcity was the background music of prehistory, then winter was the crescendo, the part where the violins screeched, the drums thundered, and everyone braced themselves for the storm. Seasonal starvation was not an abstract concept. It was the brutal rhythm of life. Feast in the summer, panic in the fall, suffer in the winter. And if spring came late, well, that might be the end of your group's story. Picture a winter night in the Paleolithic. The fire flickers weakly, fueled by scraps of wood scavenged from the frozen ground. The wind howls outside, slipping through cracks in the hut or cave, cutting straight into the bone. Bellies are hollow, every rib showing, every limb shaking from cold and hunger. A pot bubbles faintly, but inside isn't stew as we think of it. It's water flavored with scraps, bones boiled again and again, until every last bit of fat and marrow has been coaxed out. That was dinner. That was breakfast. That was survival. The rivers are frozen, which means no fish. The plants are dead, buried under snow. Herd animals have migrated south, far out of reach. Hunting parties return empty-handed more often than not, and even when they succeed, the meat is tough, lean, barely enough to keep people alive. Everyone loses weight. Everyone feels the gnawing in their stomach. Everyone watches the food supply dwindle and calculates how many days are left. And then, the impossible decisions begin. Do you ration the last scraps carefully, stretching them out so that everyone starves slowly but together? Or do you feed the strongest more, ensuring they can still hunt, while the weakest quietly fade away? Imagine a mother holding her baby, knowing her milk has dried up, knowing the tribe cannot spare food for an infant who contributes nothing. Her arms ache with love, but her stomach aches with hunger. Winter forces her to decide, cling to hope, or end the suffering quickly. Seasonal starvation wasn't just about food, it was about energy. Chopping wood burned calories. Fetching water burned calories. Even shivering burned calories. Everything you did in winter cost energy that wasn't being replaced. Families huddled closer, conserving warmth, conserving movement. Conversations grew shorter, laughs rarer, because even joy required effort. Yet, again, humor sneaked in. Someone might joke about how they used to complain about summer heat, now wishing they could sweat again. Someone else might point at the frozen river and mutter that at least the fish weren't going anywhere. These tiny sparks of humor were enough to keep despair at bay, if only for a while. Seasonal starvation left marks on the body and the spirit. Bones of prehistoric people show evidence of malnutrition cycles, like tree rings recording hard winters. Teeth reveal lines of interrupted growth, scars of hunger etched into enamel. And still, somehow, people survived. They survived by tightening belts that didn't exist, by making brutal choices, by enduring winters that felt endless. Spring was salvation. The first green shoots, the first migrating animals returning, the first thawed rivers filled with fish. But many never made it to spring. Many were buried beneath snow, their bodies curled in shallow graves, their stories cut short by a season too harsh to outlast. And yet, the tribes that endured passed down knowledge. They learned to dry meat in autumn, to bury roots for storage, to plan ahead for lean times. These strategies slowly transformed survival from blind luck into calculated resilience. But even the best planning couldn't erase the cruelty of winter. Parents still faced impossible decisions. Babies still cried in the night, and sometimes silence was the only way to protect the group. Seasonal starvation was the ultimate reminder of humanity's fragility. The fire might flicker, the snow might pile higher, but people clung to life anyway. They huddled, they shared, they sacrificed. They chose, again and again, to keep going, even when winter offered them every reason to give up. And in that choice, in that stubborn refusal to vanish, humanity endured. When we look back at the idea of burying infants alive, it's easy to frame it with our modern lens. Cruelty, desperation, a brutal finality. But early humans did not always see it that way. To them, death was not necessarily the end. It was a doorway, a return, a passage back into the mysterious cycles of earth and sky. What might feel like unthinkable cruelty to us was, to them, sometimes wrapped in a blanket of meaning and ritual. It was not just killing, it was returning a soul. Early humans lived in a world where spirits were everywhere. Every rustle of leaves, every animal that crossed their path, every flash of lightning or roll of thunder had meaning. The world was thick with presence, alive with forces that were invisible yet undeniable. To bury a child was to release them into that world, to give them back to the spirits, the ancestors, the unseen powers that wove life and death together. Imagine a mother kneeling on the cold earth, tears streaking her face, whispering to her child as she lays them down. Her words are not, "Goodbye forever." They are, "Go back, little one. Return to where you came from." To her, the act isn't abandonment. It's restoration, sending the soul back into the great cycle, so that perhaps, one day, it might return again, in another body, another season. In that framework, the unbearable becomes bearable. This belief gave shape to rituals. Sprinkling ochre over the tiny body wasn't just decoration, it was symbolically giving the child life again, the color of blood and vitality, a sign that their spirit was rejoining the larger fabric of existence. Wrapping them in furs was not about warmth, but about dignity, protection for the journey to the unseen world. Even choosing where to bury them carried meaning. Beneath the hearth, then their spirit would remain near the fire, part of the family's warmth and survival. At the edge of the camp, then their soul might guard the boundaries, standing as a quiet sentinel. This way of seeing softened impossible choices. For mothers and fathers, it was easier to believe they were not ending a life but redirecting it. The baby's soul wasn't gone. It had simply slipped back into the mysterious reservoir of being. Some cultures thousands of years later would carry echoes of this same thinking. Reincarnation myths, stories of ancestral spirits, returning in new children, legends that said a baby born after loss carried the same spirit as the one before. Of course, not every tribe or family saw it this way. Belief systems varied wildly, but the common thread was this: meaning made, survival possible. If life was only hunger, loss, and suffering, despair would crush the spirit. But if life and death were both part of an endless circle, if loss meant a return instead of an ending, then grief became survivable. Death was terrible, but not meaningless. Humor, oddly enough, even crept into this domain. Around the fire, someone might mutter that the ancestors were greedy, always calling babies back too soon. Another might tease that old Uncle so-and-so, who had died last season, must be hogging all the newborn souls for himself, leaving the tribe with only the stubborn ones. These jokes weren't blasphemy, they were coping. Finding a smile in the shadow of grief, keeping despair from swallowing the group whole. The idea of returning a soul also gave parents permission to let go. Instead of torturing themselves with guilt, they could tell themselves, the spirits wanted the child back. Instead of seeing themselves as killers, they could see themselves as participants in a sacred exchange, trading short suffering for eternal rest. And in this strange, haunting way, spiritual belief made impossible acts endurable. To us, burying a baby alive feels like the most horrifying of choices. But to them, it could be framed as an act of love, a final protection. ensuring the child did not suffer hunger, cold, or predators, but was instead sent swiftly back to the world of the ancestors. In that sense, spiritual belief was not just religion. It was survival for the soul, a way to keep human hearts from breaking under the weight of reality. And while the rituals and myths varied, the core idea was the same. The child was not lost forever. The child had returned. All of this, the grief, the ritual, the meaning, would be only speculation, if not for the silent testimony of the earth. Archaeologists have spent decades uncovering traces of prehistoric life, and among the bones of mammoths, the tools of flint, the shards of ochre, they have also found the smallest and most haunting evidence of all: the skeletons of infants, buried beneath homes and hearths. Imagine the scene: a team of archaeologists on their knees in the dust, brushing carefully with tiny tools, revealing bones no larger than a bird's. The soil has held them for thousands of years, the fragile outlines of a baby who once lived, once breathed, once cried in the night. Sometimes these skeletons are curled, as if still in sleep. Sometimes they are wrapped in remnants of cloth or hide. Sometimes they are stained with ochre, glowing red against the pale bone. And sometimes they are found right beneath the floors of dwellings, as though the family wanted the child to remain within the heartbeat of the home. Sites in Europe, the Middle East, and beyond tell this story again and again. At Çatalhöyük, in what is now Turkey, excavators discovered infants interred under platforms where families slept, ate, and lived their daily lives. Imagine lying down at night, knowing your lost child was literally beneath you, part of the foundation of your home. To us, it feels eerie. To them, it might have felt comforting, a way of keeping the child near, making the lost life part of the ongoing family rhythm. In Israel's Kufse cave, burials dating back nearly 100,000 years show signs of ritual care. Some graves contain children laid gently alongside adults, as though carried into the next world together. Red ochre was sprinkled over their bones, and shells, perhaps beads or ornaments, were left as offerings. These were not casual disposals. They were intentional, meaningful burials. Other sites suggest more pragmatic motives. In cramped settlements, burying infants under floors may have been partly about convenience. Graves inside the home kept the family from having to trek into dangerous landscapes while grieving. They prevented predators from catching the scent of death outside. They kept the tribe's losses hidden from rivals who might interpret many burials as a sign of weakness. Archaeology gives us these clues: the location of the grave, the position of the body, the objects or pigments left behind. Each tiny skeleton is both a tragedy and a message, whispering how people lived with grief. Sometimes, the evidence is heartbreaking in a different way. At certain sites, archaeologists have found signs that infants were buried alive. Bones with no signs of disease or injury, tiny skeletons in positions suggesting they were still wrapped tightly, as newborns often were. It's speculation, yes, but the possibility lingers. Some were placed into the earth, not because death had already come, but because it was forced, chosen, calculated, as part of the tribe's survival. And yet, even these burials show tenderness, careful placement, ochre, adornments, all suggesting that even when lives were ended deliberately, they were still honored, still grieved, still treated with reverence. The archaeology doesn't just reveal survival strategies, it reveals love, sorrow, meaning. There's even a strange intimacy in the act of burying children beneath hearths. The hearth was the fire, the warmth, the beating heart of the home. To place a baby's body there was symbolic, embedding the child into the family's very source of survival. The fire kept the living warm, while the dead rested beneath, as though protecting, or perhaps sharing in the family's endurance. Archaeologists, for all their caution, sometimes let emotion slip in their reports. It's hard not to, when you uncover a baby's skeleton curled in the soil, untouched for millennia. The bones may be silent, but they speak loudly about the reality of prehistoric life. Love intertwined with loss, survival etched into every decision, grief layered beneath the very spaces people lived in. And so, when we hear about tiny skeletons beneath homes and hearths, It isn't just about bones. It's about the echo of lullabies sung by firelight, the sharp cries of infants in the night, the grief of parents making impossible choices, and the rituals that gave meaning to unbearable loss. Archaeology gives us proof not only of survival, but of humanity, the tenderness, the sorrow, the desperate attempts to find peace in a brutal world. The most unthinkable acts are often carried out with the softest hands. In prehistory, when a mother faced the unbearable choice of letting her baby go, it wasn't done with cold detachment, but with rituals, whispers, and quiet songs. Mothers are, after all, wired to nurture. The bond between mother and child is so strong that even when survival demanded cruelty, tenderness wrapped itself around the act. How, then, did they cope? They lied to themselves. They sang lullabies. They wrapped death in the same fabric as love, so that they could keep breathing after doing the one thing no mother should ever have to do. We know, from anthropological evidence, that lullabies are ancient, older than writing, older than the wheel, maybe even older than fire. A mother's voice was the first shelter a child ever knew, the sound that soothed hunger, pain, and fear. When food ran short or predators drew near, songs carried comfort that the world could not provide. And when the decision came to lay a baby into the earth, that same voice might have sung one last lullaby, not to calm the child, who perhaps already drifted away into silence, but to calm the mother herself. Imagine her voice in the darkness of a hut, whispering through cracked lips, "Sleep now. The ancestors are waiting. You won't be hungry anymore." To her, these weren't just words. They were incantations, lies turned into truths by sheer need. If she told herself the child would be cared for in another world, then maybe she could survive the guilt of knowing she could not care for them in this one. Rituals gave structure to grief. Some mothers sprinkled ochre over the body as if painting their child with life once more. Others buried their babies beneath hearths so the warmth of the fire could continue to reach them. Some left beads, shells, or tiny ornaments beside the body, tokens of love in miniature. These rituals weren't practical. They were psychological scaffolding, giving the mind something to cling to when it was otherwise drowning in despair. And there were comforting lies, whispered so quietly they might not even have been fully believed. Lies like, "This isn't the end." Lies like, "You'll come back to me, in another season, in another form." Lies like, "The spirits will feed you, and you'll be warm forever." Mothers lied to themselves because the truth that they were ending a life they had carried, birthed, and loved was too heavy to hold. But lies weren't the only tool. Community stepped in to soften the blow. Other women, who had faced the same losses, comforted grieving mothers. They likely shared songs, chants, and stories meant to reassure. Maybe they pointed to the stars and said, "There, that's where the children go." Maybe they made jokes, dark but tender, about babies being too loud even for the spirit world, as though even in death children kept their mischievous spark. Humor has always been a salve, and if it seems inappropriate now, it was survival then. Archaeology sometimes shows us evidence of these coping mechanisms. In burials, we find shells polished smooth, not by nature, but by hands that rubbed them during moments of sorrow. We find ochre poured generously over tiny bones, far more than was necessary, as if drowning the child in color could make up for what the earth was about to take. We find infants buried close to mothers, their skeletons intertwined, as if the woman couldn't quite let go even in death. These traces whisper of the ways mothers softened reality to make it bearable. And in truth, coping didn't mean forgetting. These women carried their grief with them. They remembered the weight of the child in their arms, the smell of their skin, the sound of their cry. They told themselves the comforting lies, but deep down, they knew the loss would never vanish. What they learned, instead, was how to live with it, how to keep moving, how to keep caring for the living children who still needed them, how to keep stoking the fire, even when their hearts felt cold. Coping was not about erasing pain. It was about surviving it. Songs, rituals, lies, they were the thin threads mothers used to stitch themselves back together after tearing their hearts apart. And because they found ways to cope, they endured. They passed their strength down through generations. And in that endurance, in those whispered songs and whispered lies, we find the roots of humanity's most remarkable trait, the ability to keep loving, even when love costs everything. It would be comforting to think that burying infants alive was a unique, isolated tragedy of prehistoric life. But the truth is much harder to swallow. Versions of infanticide appear across cultures, across continents, and across millennia. Survival, as it turns out, sometimes demanded the same harsh arithmetic everywhere, and though the details varied, the grim logic was shared. In ancient Sparta, for example, babies were inspected by elders to judge their health and strength. A child deemed too weak or deformed was abandoned on a hillside, left for the gods or the elements to decide their fate. To the Spartans, this wasn't murder. It was civic duty, a way to ensure the community's strength. Harsh, yes, but in their eyes, it was necessary for the survival of the state. Imagine explaining that to a modern parenting blog. Among Inuit groups in the Arctic, the practice of infanticide was sometimes tied to the brutal mathematics of resource scarcity. When food was scarce and winters unforgiving, families sometimes ended the lives of newborns, particularly girls, because they could not be supported. These choices weren't made lightly. They were framed within cultural understandings of balance and survival. Some elders described it not as killing, but as sending the child back to the spirit world to wait for a better time to be born. Even here, the comforting lie of returning softened the blow. In parts of Polynesia, infanticide occurred as well, often tied to strict social or environmental pressures. Large families strained resources on small islands, and in certain situations, newborns were not kept. Again, it wasn't framed as cruelty, but as an act within a larger cultural system of survival. In some ancient Chinese dynasties, female infants were more often victims. The preference for male heirs, combined with scarcity, meant that many girls were abandoned or drowned. This practice, horrifying to us, was woven into the fabric of family economics and societal structure. When survival hinged on producing sons who could work the land and carry the family line, daughters were seen as an unbearable burden. Even in Rome, a society we often imagine as advanced and sophisticated, infants could be abandoned legally. The paterfamilias, or male head of the household, had the authority to accept or reject a newborn. A baby placed at his feet and lifted was accepted into the family. One ignored might be abandoned outside. Again, the act was not seen as murder, but as a grim practicality, framed within legal and cultural norms. What's striking across these examples is not the cruelty, but the universality. Infanticide appears not in isolated corners, but in societies as varied as Arctic hunters, Mediterranean empires, and island cultures. It is as though humanity, faced with the same equation, too many mouths, too few resources, arrived at the same solution, cloaked in ritual, framed in belief. And while the details differ, the emotional undertow remains constant. Grief, tempered by cultural justification, softened by rituals and lies, made survivable by the reassurance that the act served a higher purpose. And here's where humor, dark as it may be, still sneaks in. Imagine a Spartan father, stiff and stern, declaring that only the strongest babies would live. Meanwhile, a mother mutters under her breath, "If they judged the fathers the same way, half of you wouldn't have made the cut." Humor kept humanity human, even when practices were inhumane. This grim strategy reminds us that survival has never been simple. It's easy to condemn ancient cultures for practices we find horrifying, but harder to recognize the common thread of desperation that ran through all of them. Scarcity, harsh environments, rigid social structures all forced people into impossible decisions. And while we might recoil, we also inherit the truth that our existence today is partly built on the sacrifices, however tragic, of those who came before. Infanticide was never just cruelty. It was culture adapting to impossible math, softened by ritual, justified by belief, carried out with grief, and remembered as survival. Grief can crush a person. In the prehistoric world, it could crush an entire tribe. Imagine 30 people huddled together through long winters, hunger biting, predators lurking outside, and death constantly brushing against them. If they didn't find ways to release the pressure, they would collapse under it. One of the most unlikely tools in their survival kit was humor, not light-hearted, silly humor, but the darkest kind. Jokes so grim they might make a modern audience gasp. Yet, these jokes weren't cruel. They were lifelines, woven out of desperation, sorrow, and the stubborn refusal to give despair the last word. Picture the fire at night. The wind rattles the hide stretched over the entrance, and the smoke stings everyone's eyes. They've buried a child that morning. The sadness lingers like fog. Then someone, an elder, with a cracked voice and a heart too old for fresh grief, mutters, "Well, at least the ancestors won't be lonely tonight." A few people laugh, not because it's funny, but because the sound of laughter cuts the silence in half. For a moment, grief loosens its grip. Dark humor has always been humanity's strange shield. Soldiers, in wars, tell jokes about death. Doctors in emergency rooms whisper puns to each other. Even prisoners, facing execution, have cracked jokes about their fate. Prehistoric people were no different. They knew the math of survival, knew how often children slipped away, and rather than sink completely into despair, they found ways to laugh at the absurdity of it all. A mother who lost a baby might hear another woman tease, "Don't worry, he was probably too stubborn for this world anyway. He'll come back as a hunter and eat us all." Harsh? Yes. But it might have sparked the faintest smile through tears. And laughter did something important. It bonded the group. When everyone laughs together at something unspeakable, the fear and sorrow transform into solidarity. Suddenly, the loss doesn't isolate anyone. It becomes shared, manageable, folded into the fabric of tribe life. Grief becomes part of the rhythm, accompanied not only by tears and ritual, but also by chuckles and shrugs at life's cruel jokes. Dark humor also served as teaching. Joking about death allowed people to talk about it openly without breaking. A father might warn his son, "If you don't sharpen that spear right, you'll join the ancestors early. They'll be thrilled for the company, but I won't." Beneath the laughter was a reminder. Survival required vigilance. Death was a certainty. The joke was in pretending it could be bargained with. It's easy to imagine how these jokes evolved into stories. Myths themselves often carry a streak of humor. Trickster gods, mischievous spirits, ancestors who couldn't keep out of trouble, even in the afterlife. These weren't just entertaining tales, they were emotional tools. Ways of saying, yes, death stalks us, but we can mock it. We can laugh in its face. And sometimes, the jokes were about the very rituals of death. Imagine someone teasing after a burial. "You buried him under the hearth?" Bold choice. "Now watch, the fire will burn twice as hot, and we'll all roast like rabbits." The others laugh, roll their eyes, throw a bone at him. But the laughter sticks, a reminder that even in the presence of death, life goes on, fire still burns, people still joke. There's something deeply human in this balance. Tears and laughter, sorrow and jokes, they weren't contradictions. They were partners. Without laughter, grief would drown the tribe. Without grief, laughter would ring hollow. Together, they created a rhythm that allowed people to endure. For every child laid into the earth, there were others who survived. They were not ordinary in the eyes of their tribes. They were proof that the impossible gamble sometimes paid off. Each surviving child was, in a sense, chosen not by fate, perhaps, but by the cruel calculations of survival, by the love of parents who risked everything, by the luck of strong bodies and favorable seasons. To be a surviving child was to be precious, treasured, and burdened all at once. Imagine a child toddling near the fire, laughter echoing in the cramped hut. Everyone watches. Not just the parents, everyone. Because that child represents the future of the group. The proof that survival is possible. That the tribe's stories, tools, and rituals will not vanish into the snow. A surviving child was more than an individual. They were continuity. They were hope. This didn't mean their lives were easy. In fact, the opposite. Surviving children carried enormous expectations. They had to learn quickly, absorb every scrap of knowledge, how to find edible plants, how to throw a spear, how to listen for danger in the forest, how to sit still during rituals. Their mistakes weren't just theirs. They could mean danger for everyone. Survival had a curriculum, and the chosen ones were enrolled from birth. But they were also cherished. If food was scarce, children often ate first. Adults went hungry, so the young could grow strong enough to carry the tribe's future. Elders told stories directly to them, repeating the words again and again, etching memory into young minds as though carving into stone. When a child laughed, it brightened everyone. When they cried, the whole group leaned in to hush them. When they survived another winter, it was cause for celebration, a little victory against the odds. Yet being chosen came with shadows. Surviving children often grew up beside memories of siblings who hadn't made it. Imagine a 6-year-old who plays outside a hut that literally shelters the graves of 3 lost siblings. Imagine hearing parents whisper their names in the dark, or watching them place food near the hearth as offerings. Surviving children grew up understanding death intimately, knowing their own lives had been spared where others were not. The weight of that knowledge shaped them, sharpening their awareness, deepening their sense of responsibility. In some ways, these children became the embodiment of the tribe's resilience. They carried stories not just in words, but in their very existence. They were the ones who would one day explain to their own children why survival had required sacrifices. And while they might not have thought of themselves as lucky life was still brutally hard, they were seen by others as proof that luck existed at all. The chosen ones also carried the tribe's laughter. Their games, their clumsy imitations of adults, their surprising questions, they were sparks of humor that kept the group sane. A child pretending to spear a mammoth with a stick, missing, and tumbling into the snow might make everyone roar with laughter. That laughter wasn't just amusement, it was relief. Life continued. The tribe had a future, and it was messy, funny, and loud. And as those children grew, they became the storytellers, the hunters, the mothers and fathers who would one day face the same impossible decisions. The cycle continued, each generation both blessed and cursed by survival. Being chosen wasn't just about living through childhood. It was about carrying the torch of humanity forward, even when the flame flickered low. So when we look back, when we see the bones of children beneath ancient hearths, we should also picture the ones who ran, who laughed, who grew, who carried fire and stories into the future. They were the chosen ones, not because they were destined, but because they survived. And their survival meant that eventually, after countless winters, we would be here to remember them. When we look back at the vast expanse of prehistory, it's tempting to imagine survival as some kind of athletic contest, as though the gold medal went to the fastest hunter, the strongest warrior, the woman with the biggest arms to carry the most firewood. Strength certainly mattered, but it wasn't the deciding factor. If it had been, humanity might not be here at all. What truly shaped us wasn't brute force, but adaptability. We were never the strongest creatures on the plains. We weren't the fastest. We weren't even the ones with the sharpest teeth, unless you count that one uncle with a suspicious grin. What kept us alive, what molded us into who we are today, was our ability to bend, to change, to improvise in the face of disaster. Imagine a harsh winter. The mammoth herds are gone, the rivers frozen, the berries long vanished. The strongest man in the tribe, broad, shouldered, all muscle, the kind who can throw a spear the length of a hut. What happens to him when there's no food to fuel those muscles? He weakens, he collapses, and suddenly all that strength is useless. Meanwhile, the adaptable ones are figuring out how to boil roots, how to trap small animals, how to chew on bark until it releases something vaguely edible. Adaptability, not biceps, filled the belly. This pattern repeated in every challenge. A drought arrived, and the adaptable survived by walking further, learning where hidden springs bubbled up, or storing water in animal skins. A predator attacked, and instead of standing firm and flexing like some prehistoric superhero, the adaptable climbed a tree, threw rocks from a distance, or simply ran in a zigzag pattern that confused the lion long enough to escape. Strong people died heroic deaths. adaptable people, lived long enough to tell stories about them. Adaptability wasn't just about finding food or avoiding teeth. It was about social survival, too. In a cramped hut, where tempers flared and nerves frayed, the strongest weren't necessarily the ones who kept peace. The adaptable ones smoothed conflicts, cracked jokes, brokered compromises. They were the glue that kept groups from splintering apart. Because in a world of 30 people, one serious argument could fracture the tribe, and a fractured tribe was often a dead one. Adaptability meant flexibility of spirit, bending instead of breaking. This is why children who made it through those brutal odds weren't necessarily the biggest or the boldest. They were the ones who learned quickly, who could imitate adults, who could remember which plants killed and which healed, who could turn knowledge into survival. In that way, adaptability shaped not only who survived but who thrived. Intelligence, memory, creativity, these were the tools sharpened by adaptation. And of course, humor was part of adaptability too. Think of how jokes lightened despair. When someone muttered about eating their own shoes, the laughter wasn't strength, it was flexibility, a way of reshaping fear into something survivable. Humor was the psychological spear, protecting the mind when the body faltered. Over generations, adaptability became our inheritance. We became the species that could live anywhere on icy tundras, in scorching deserts, in damp caves, in sprawling grasslands. Lions could dominate savannas. Bears ruled forests. But humans learned to adapt to all of it. We carried fire, we carried tools, and most importantly, we carried the ability to change. Strength fades, speed slows, even sharp teeth dull. But adaptability endures. That's how it shaped us, not into the strongest, not into the fastest, but into the most stubbornly flexible species on the planet. And that flexibility, that willingness to reinvent ourselves again and again, is why we're still here. If survival in prehistory was a test, it was the cruelest kind. Long, grueling, and graded on a curve no one wanted to be on. And even though we, the descendants, have passed the test, the marks of it are still written in our bodies. Our genetics carry the fingerprints of ancient stress, the echoes of small populations teetering on the edge of extinction. You could say our DNA is a haunted house, creaking floorboards, hidden scars, stories of near disaster built into its very walls. Geneticists today can peer into that code and see the bottlenecks of the past. They see how, thousands of years ago, the human population shrank to nearly nothing, numbers so small that all of us alive today descend from just a few thousand individuals, perhaps fewer. That kind of reduction leaves permanent traces. Imagine a great library with millions of books, and then a fire burns it down to just 1,000 volumes. The books that remain still tell stories, but vast amounts of knowledge are gone forever. Human genetics went through that fire. The diversity was slashed, leaving us with far less variety than our closest primate cousins. Chimpanzees, scattered across forests, are genetically richer than 8 billion humans combined. This loss of diversity came with consequences. Our immune systems are weaker than they should be, making us more vulnerable to certain diseases. Some genetic disorders persist not because they're useful, but because in small populations, random quirks spread quickly. When there are only a few families left, one odd mutation can become standard in a handful of generations. Some of the problems we carry today, diseases, deficiencies, fragile systems, are the ghosts of ancient survival math. Yet, there's another side. Stress also sharpened traits that helped us endure. Intelligence, cooperation, adaptability. These may have flourished precisely because our ancestors were squeezed so hard. In small groups, information mattered desperately. Those who could remember, improvise, and cooperate had a survival advantage. Natural selection, in that crucible, didn't reward the loudest roar or the biggest muscles. It rewarded brains that could solve problems and communities that could stick together. The bottleneck shaped our minds as much as our genes, and the traces go beyond biology. Culturally, we still act like a species that remembers famine. Why do so many people crave sugar and fat, even when we're surrounded by abundance. Because our bodies were tuned in an era when calories were rare, and anyone who could store energy efficiently had an edge. Why do we panic at scarcity, even irrationally hoarding toilet paper at the first whisper of crisis? That's ancient memory. Echoes of winters, when supplies meant life or death. The stress even shows in our stories. Across cultures, myths speak of floods, fires, disasters that wiped out most of humanity. These tales may be exaggerations, but at their root lies a memory. We have faced near extinction before. Our ancestors told stories of survival not just to entertain, but to remind future generations of the fragility of life. The stress carved itself not only into DNA, but into culture. Humor, once again, carried through. People today joke about their bad genes, their weak stomachs, their tendency to get sick every winter. Those jokes are the echoes of ancient tribes laughing at the absurdity of their fragility, shrugging at the unfairness of bodies cobbled together under duress. Humor doesn't erase the scars, it makes them livable. So yes, our genetics still carry the shadows of ancient stress. But those shadows are also proof of resilience. We survived famine, disease, near annihilation. We carry weaknesses, yes, but also the strengths that came with enduring. We are fragile, but we are here. Every cell of our body whispers the same story. We are the children of survivors, carrying both their scars and their strength. Morality is a slippery thing. We like to imagine it as something eternal, carved into the stone of the universe. A list of rules whispered by the stars. Don't kill, don't steal, love your neighbor, and all that. But the truth is, morality bends. It bends under pressure, under famine, under snowstorms that last for months, under the weight of a crying infant, when there is no food to keep it alive. What we consider an unthinkable act today might once have been simply survival. And what was once survival can, over time, harden into taboo. Take infanticide, for instance. In prehistory, it was a calculation, not a crime. Too many mouths meant too few chances for the tribe to make it through the winter. A sickly baby might not last anyway, and keeping them alive could drag everyone down. Ending their life was framed not as murder, but as grim responsibility. Parents wept. Yes, but they also understood the math. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about protecting the group. In that world, the line between love and death was tragically thin. But as the centuries turned, things changed. Agriculture arrived, and with it, a new relationship to food. Suddenly, people could store grain, keep animals, plan for lean seasons. The razor-thin margins widened just enough that a baby who might once have been considered a burden could be carried into adulthood. And with abundance, or at least the possibility of it, came a shift in morality. What was once necessary began to feel unnecessary, and once unnecessary, it became wrong. Cultures began to weave morality into their stories, their laws, their gods. In the Hebrew Bible, the idea of children as blessings, gifts from God, took root. To kill them was to reject the divine. In early Christian thought, infanticide became sin, an act associated with cruelty and paganism. In ancient Rome, where it had once been legal to abandon unwanted infants, laws slowly shifted to discourage the practice. What was once ordinary became shocking. What was once survival became taboo. This shift wasn't sudden. Like all moral changes, it moved slowly, generation by generation, as circumstances improved. People didn't wake up one morning and say, "From now on, burying babies is evil." Instead, they carried forward whispers of the old ways while gradually adopting new values. Grandmothers told stories of the time when choices were different, but their daughters raised children under new rules. Survival didn't demand the same sacrifices, so morality had room to expand. It's almost comical, in a tragic way, how morality shifts with abundance. Imagine a prehistoric mother, exhausted, facing the impossible, whispering a song as she buries her infant under the hearth. Then leap forward thousands of years to a Roman matron, scolding her neighbor, "You abandoned your baby? What kind of monster are you?" And then leap again to us today, gasping at the very idea, our bellies full, our homes warm, our cupboards lined with food we may never finish. Each stage is sincere. Each believes it is right. But each stage was shaped not by eternal law, but by survival pressure, or the easing of it. Humor fits here too, because humans can't resist laughing at their contradictions. Perhaps in the first cities, people whispered dark jokes about how their ancestors had fed the gods with babies, shaking their heads with both horror and a wink. Maybe some cynical villager teased, well, at least the old way meant fewer mouths at the table. Joking about the past allowed people to distance themselves from it, to affirm their new morality, while still acknowledging the ghosts of survival that lingered behind it. And here's the haunting part. Morality will likely keep shifting. The rules we consider absolute today may one day look different. What if a future generation looks back at us and says, they let people starve in a world of abundance? How monstrous. They may gasp at our waste, our wars, our cruelty to the environment. Just as we gasp at infanticide, they will gasp at us. Morality bends, because it has always bent. Still, the bending tells us something hopeful. It means that as survival becomes easier, as abundance grows, humanity tends toward compassion. What was once necessary becomes unthinkable. What was once tolerated becomes taboo. And that slow march of morality, however imperfect, is the reason you and I live in a world where the cry of a baby means comfort, not calculation, where survival, for most of us, no longer requires sacrifice at the cost of our children. Now, as we leave the long shadows of prehistory behind, let's return gently to the present. You are lying here, safe, listening to a voice that travels through wires and air, while outside, the night presses softly against your windows. The world feels quiet, and unlike your ancestors, you don't have to worry that a predator is stalking just beyond the firelight. You don't have to decide which child will live through the winter, or whether to bury an infant beneath the hearth. You are here, and you are safe. Think of what your ancestors endured. Nights so cold their bones ached, stomachs so empty the air itself felt like food, grief so heavy it bent their backs. And yet, they survived. They adapted, endured, whispered songs to themselves, and told jokes so they could keep laughing when everything else said cry. Through all that pain, they carried forward the fragile thread of life. That thread stretched across centuries and now rests in you. You are the descendant of survivors, of people who made impossible choices, of mothers and fathers who clung to life, even when life gave them no reason. Now look at where you are. Your bed is soft. Your blankets are warm. The air around you is not filled with smoke or freezing wind, but steady, comfortable silence. Your refrigerator hums in the next room, filled with food you didn't have to chase, berries you didn't have to fight the birds for. Your lights glow at the touch of a button. Your water runs clear from a faucet. Everything that once was scarce now surrounds you in abundance. That doesn't mean your life is free of hardship. But compared to the icy huts, the endless hunger, the brutal math of survival, you live in luxury. So profound your ancestors could never have dreamed of it. If you could carry them here, into this room, they would marvel at your electric fire, at the glow of your screen, at the fact that you can lie in comfort, while someone tells you a story across time and distance. They would call this a miracle, and they would be right. So as you drift into sleep, hold on to that miracle, hold on to the warmth of your blankets, the safety of your walls, the abundance of your world. You are not in a cave fighting for firewood. You are not huddled in the dark while predators circle. You are not making impossible choices. You are alive, safe, warm, and free to rest. Take a slow breath in and let it go. Feel the heaviness of your body sinking into your bed. Listen to the silence around you. This is your hearth, your sanctuary, your abundance. Let the ghosts of the past recede, their whispers fading into gratitude. They endured so that you could be here, and you, in this quiet moment, honor them simply by resting. Sleep now, under the soft light of your modern fire. You are safe, you are warm, You are the child who survived, the descendant of the chosen ones. And tomorrow, when you wake, the world will still be waiting, full of abundance, full of light. But for now, close your eyes, let your breathing slow, let your mind drift. You have made it through the long winter. The fire is yours. Sleep. And that's the end of tonight's story. You've walked through the shadows of our ancestors, and now it's time to let go. To drift into the warmth of sleep they once only dreamed of. Rest well, breathe deeply, and let your body sink into comfort. If your eyes are still open, you can keep exploring. Just click on one of the 2 videos on the screen to continue the journey. And if you'd like more stories like this to fall asleep to, make sure to subscribe. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.